Okay, so good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are located here in the United States, and welcome to today's NACC webinar, which is session 1 of the webinar entitled Addressing the Spiritual Needs of Persons with Dementia, presented by Dr. Debbie Armenta. For your information, session 2 will be at the same time, noon, next Tuesday, November the 26th, and the third and last session will be on Tuesday, December the 3rd, also at noon, and this is Central Time. We'd like to thank Dr. Armenta very much for agreeing to do this webinar series. I think it's a subject matter which is very current and topical and important, so I'm glad that you could all join us, and I'm glad that Dr. Armenta agreed to lead this webinar series. Before we start, I'd like to lead us in a short prayer. And this is called Light for One Another. It's from a publication called Sacred Works, Sacred Words, published by Wheaton Franciscan Healthcare. Holy One, Source of Life, Spirit of all healing, bless those who serve the sick. Direct and guide us. Remembering that each of us will take our turns in darkness and in light, let us be light for one another when the darkness falls. Gentle our hands, soften our eyes, open a window in our hearts so that your grace and loving kindness may shine through. Make of our attention a safe shelter for the healing of the sick in mind and heart, spirit and body. Renew us always in your love. Amen.
Amen.
So let me briefly introduce Dr. Armenta. Dr. Debbie Armenta is an assistant professor of pastoral theology and an associate coordinator of teaching parish formation program for Mundelein Seminary. Dr. Armenta spent over 3 decades in parish and diocesan ministry, as well as chaplaincy in 4 dioceses across the U.S. She has an MA and an MDiv and completed her doctorate in spirituality as a Bernardin scholar at Catholic Theological Union. Her doctoral dissertation appropriates Eastern Christian desert spirituality for formation of ministers in the church. Additional certifications and training for Dr. Armenta include courses in spirituality, spiritual direction leadership, pastoral associate certification, and dementia person-centered care training. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Armenta and turn the mic over to her.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Andres, and welcome everyone. It's a joy and a privilege to be here. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever you happen to be on the map. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, and my hope and my prayer has been and is that we all kind of journey together through this. I've had the joy and the privilege of working with persons in a variety of situations for the last 10 years in terms of dementia and Alzheimer's, and then a very personal journey with my father for 12 years before he passed away a few years ago. So I just have a deep love for the topic and for our beloved family members and community members with dementia. So we're going to get started. I'm going to take you through some slides. You have the kind of the topic headings when you signed up, and we'll save all questions for the end, and we'll just kind of journey together. So I'm going to begin today, and we're going to talk about the objectives and learning outcomes just very quickly. So the intent is that when we finish up today for this first session, that we'll be able to, that we will have identified, discussed, and analyzed the complexities of the spiritual needs of persons with dementia, that we will identify the particular context in which the person with dementia is living in order to address specific spiritual needs. And Andres was great to send me the list of where many of you serve as chaplains, as volunteers, as pastoral care directors. So there's a huge kind of umbrella under which each of us work. And then we will identify some of the challenges for the individual and the families in relationship to spiritual care. And this will continue on in the second and third series because they really do all sort of tie together. So I'd like to begin just with some context, facts, dementia versus Alzheimer's. And many of you may be familiar with some of these facts, some of you may not, but I think it's always good to start with context because that's what plays into the work that we do. And this resource from Teepa Snow, I did get written approval to use her slides. My encouragement is that you don't reproduce these, that you do go to her website. She's got marvelous resources, absolutely brilliant actually. And so to just give an overview, and I get this question from a lot of people, well, what is the difference between dementia or Alzheimer's? Dementia is actually the umbrella under which the various forms of some kind of disease in the brain falls. So Alzheimer's disease is one form of dementia, and it's one that we're most commonly familiar with. And then there are the frontotemporal dementias, Lewy body's disease, and then vascular dementias. And these all manifest themselves in unique ways. And then there are sort of a multitude of other types of dementias. And I would even encourage you to just maybe do quick searches on these to just try to understand the differences between them, because we'll go through some of the ways that they do manifest themselves differently and how this can potentially impact the spiritual care that we provide for folks. So this is our, this is just kind of the overview of what dementia looks like. So some of the numbers, and this is hugely relevant, and it impacts personal care, it impacts pastoral care, as well as impacts, many of us having provided care for our loved ones, that worldwide there are 50 million people living with dementia, which is significant. 5.8 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's. By 2050, this number is projected to rise to nearly 14 million. Between 2000 and 2017, deaths from heart disease have decreased by 9%, while deaths from Alzheimer's have increased by 145%. These are sobering statistics. Every 65 seconds, someone in the United States develops the disease. And 1 in 3 seniors dies with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, and dementia kills more than breast cancer and prostate cancer patients combined. And if you haven't accessed the Alzheimer's website, alzheimers.org, it's a plethora of incredible information, and I strongly encourage you to do that. So again, using one of Teepa Snow's resources, there are 4 truths about all dementias. And this is important for us as chaplains, as pastoral caregivers, to just be aware that at least 2 parts of the brain are dying. They're dying when we're providing spiritual care to someone with a disease from dementia. It keeps changing and it keeps getting worse, and it is progressive. It is not curable or fixable. It's a chronic disease and it results in death. It is a terminal disease. And I won't go through each of these particular categories, but this is laid out very nicely. And it kind of shows some of the differentiation between Alzheimer's, Lewy body, vascular dementia, and then the frontotemporal dementia. And it sort of gives you a nice insight into the way some of these diseases manifest themselves in a very particular way. So I encourage you to go back to that as you have an opportunity to just kind of review it. And again, it's available on her website as well. So we talk a lot about the stages of dementia, and this is important, particularly I think if you work in a long-term care facility, as I did for several years, and we watch the progression of the disease, or as I did on a personal level with my own father. So in the early stages, or with mild dementia or Alzheimer's, there becomes the initial problem with communicating. There's trouble remembering when first introduced, and there's increased trouble planning or organizing. And then as the disease begins to progress, mid-stage or moderate dementia or Alzheimer's. There is a forgetfulness of events, of one's own personal narrative, feeling moody or withdrawn, especially socially challenging in situations, confusion about where they are, increased risk of being lost, personality changes, bladder changes, delusions, and suspicious types of, they're very suspicious about even loved ones that they've known their whole lives. And then late stage or severe dementia or Alzheimer's is when we really see the need for the round-the-clock assistance. There is a loss of awareness of recent experiences and surroundings, increased difficulty in the community or in any sort of larger setting. And in many ways, they're not even able to really be in the larger setting. Experience changes in physical abilities, including the ability to walk, sit, and swallow. And as I was really praying over these slides, I recall one woman, and I just offer this, I'm sure you all have somebody that you can kind of recall that came into our long-term program for dementia care. And she was a woman who was hugely active in the community. She was very involved with her faith community. She was a giver. She was a doer. She was a mother of 3 adult children. But she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And initially she could come to religious services with a group and she could sit and she enjoyed them. And as the disease progressed and she became less and less capable of being in that setting, she would stay in the unit and we would go in, I would go in and provide spiritual care for her one-on-one. And then during the last stages, actually she had become very combative, and then it was just really individual care in her room. And it was just it was a sacred but painful journey to be with her, very, very graced. So there is one other scale that I want to just introduce you to. And again, you're welcome to look this up, but I think it just gives a little bit of a broader awareness of how sometimes the scale is set, whether it's in a medical facility or in a nursing home. They tend to look at the deterioration in 7 stages. So there's no significant decline in stage 1, very mild cognitive decline in stage 2, mild cognitive decline that is continuing to increase in stage 3, and then moderate cognitive decline by stage 4. And this is where some of the really practical tasks that they've been doing their whole lives become increasingly difficult. And then by stage 5, moderate to severe cognitive decline, may need help bathing, needs help choosing clothing, and then severe cognitive decline and loss of awareness of recent events and experiences, fear of bathing, and loss of toileting abilities. And we experienced this very, very significantly actually with my father, who was a man of great pride and dignity. And it was very difficult when he reached stage 5 and stage 6. And then by stage 7, very severe cognitive decline, loses ability to walk and sit, needs assistance eating. And that's when typically it's nonverbal, no communication, little recognition, sleeping a lot. And you really see the decline and journeying towards the end of this life. So just a few more kind of facts to give some context. Approximately 60 to 80% of dementia is identified as Alzheimer's disease. So that's, so many times, you know, we do hear that diagnosed with Alzheimer's, or, you know, rather than diagnosed with a different form of dementia. But dementia and Alzheimer's, they are not a normal part of aging. It is a disease. And this is important because I know frequently I hear, well, you know, we're just getting older. Well, the actual deterioration of the brain is not a normal part of aging. It is a disease. It's a diagnosed disease. Dementia and Alzheimer's is not mild cognitive impairment that comes with aging. That is a normal part of aging. Though some people with mild cognitive impairment can progress into Alzheimer's. So there's no definitive there. So just a couple of things that that I know that all of us are experienced enough to be aware of, but these are always good. I mean, I just review these in my own care and being aware of them, that persons with dementia cannot help what is happening. And I know we may hear or we may believe that they know, but they don't. And persons with dementia cannot control what is happening to them. And I remember when my dad was first diagnosed, and this was very difficult for my mom, and they had been married close to 50 years, and he had dementia for 12 years, was the lack of understanding when he was first diagnosed with the disease. And well, you know, he should know this, he should know this. Well, they don't know, especially when it's somebody close to you, when it's your spouse or somebody that you've been very close to through your life. And we do know this. We know this as chaplains. It's absolutely wrong to criticize or to get angry or to personalize. They cannot control what is happening to them. And then when dementia gets frustrating, we must remember it's the disease that is frustrating, not the person. And I think of this marvelous woman that I still pray for, that I was really blessed to care for to the end of her life, who had almost no family. And she became just very, very angry at the end of her life, but she still was receptive to having somebody come in and just have prayer with her. But she couldn't control the different things that were going on with her. And it was just an opportunity for me as a chaplain to be in there, to be with her and to provide some comfort and some care. And this is always important. Does the intellectual capacity define a person's worth and dignity? And we know that that is absolutely not true. And I love this quote, and as I said, we'll have resources at the end. Human beings are much more than sharp minds, powerful rememberers, and economic successes. That there is much more, of course, to each person than the sort of benchmarks of success, particularly in our sort of individualistic driven culture. So spiritual care for persons with dementia, what should this look like? Now let's talk a little bit about it. Probably one of the things that I hear most, and actually that grieves me deeply, is why should I bother? They don't recognize or remember anyway. And you may have had experience with family members who have said this. You know, we experienced this in my own family. I'm one of 7 siblings, and the challenges of dealing with our own grief. And I would really liken this in many ways to this type of question coming from somebody. I'd liken it to grief, to fear, to the loss of losing somebody as you know them. So I really spent a lot of time with this, and over my years, even in my CPE, I really believe in this, that I would encourage all of us as chaplains, as spiritual caregivers, whatever capacity you work in, is to develop a personal theology of dementia for your life, ministry, and for those under your care. And I think that when we consciously frame something under a personal theology, it really gives us not only validation, but it just reminds us, and it just continues to shape the work that we do in a sacred framework. So my personal theology of dementia, which I'm going to share with you in a moment, is a compilation of my personal assumptions and my personal faith background. And all of this undergirds my approach to my life, and then also to the vocations in which I work. My work at the seminary, my work in hospice, my work as a wife and as a mother as well. So my theology of dementia is as follows. I believe that all persons are inherently created in the image and likeness of our divine creator, and each person is imbued with the spirit of our creator God. All persons have innate dignity, and are worthy of and deserve love and care. And then finally, in particular, for those most marginalized and suffering from physical and mental decline, deserve greater attention so as to be brought into relationship so they may know their dignity and worth through love and care received. And I'm sure that you know, in your own work, that all of us, I think, those of us called to chaplaincy, we have a deep desire to be present to those that are suffering and the marginalized. And the folks that we minister to and with in dementia, that have dementia or Alzheimer's, in many ways are some of the most marginalized in our communities. I happen to be a minister in the Catholic Church, and working with families to try to bring support services to families in parishes, hugely challenging. And so how do we do this as chaplains, to always be aware that those suffering through these diseases are marginalized, and how can we be present to them and bring the face of Jesus Christ to them? So dementia, dignity, and honoring God. How can a tragedy such as dementia be dignified? How can dementia honor God? And this really kind of, I want to say, rocked my world, because in many ways the disease can be a conduit to really honor God, or honor our individual higher powers as we know God in our own lives, or know our own higher power. Over and over again, I have seen God honored when others respects the inherent dignity of those afflicted with dementia. It happens because the dignity of everyone, including those with dementia, is rooted in nothing less than the fact that we are all made in the image and likeness of God. And I would imagine that if I asked every single one of you, each of us have expressed the very words that when I go into a room, even if I'm feeling a little bit low in energy and resources, that each time I leave with much more than I ever could have imagined. The blessing and the sacredness of those visits, of those encounters, of those prayer services, of those moments of hand-holding or sacred singing with a person or with a group that has dementia. This is where God or our beloved higher power is honored in all of these settings. So one of the key pieces of ministering, of course, to persons with dementia, with Alzheimer's, the needs of all persons, and more so for those journeying with dementia, is the relational needs. And we know this in our own lives. You know, relational isolation leads, of course, to social isolation, and social isolation leads to spiritual isolation and desolation, particularly for persons with dementia, because as the disease progresses, we watch them become increasingly isolated. Spiritual care, of course, as we all know, is all about relationship, and that being present, and that being in the moment. So for persons with dementia, the relationship piece, even if you're doing visits in a very large assisted living or even memory support unit, that moment of care and that moment of being present and that moment of being with someone is really what spiritual care is all about. So what are some of the challenges of providing spiritual care for persons with dementia? And I know if I asked each of you, we would get as many answers as participants here, because there are many. But in one of the resources that I've drawn from frequently, identifies various emotional challenges for a person with dementia in the early stages and their spiritual needs. And I found this list incredibly useful, because I could, in my relationships with the people that I've been blessed to minister to, I identify these in my own mind. You know, those feelings of being alienated, or apathetic feelings, boredom, depression, feeling dominated. Imagine, and I know that, again, all of us could tell the stories of some of the most brilliant people that we have ministered to in dementia, whether it's somebody who worked on the Hubble or somebody who was a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and can no longer care for themselves, and that feeling of being dominated where everything is directed for them in a hospital or in a nursing home. Feelings of embarrassment. This is huge for someone who was completely self-sufficient and has lost all of their ability to care for themselves, to make their own decisions. They're fearful because their world is increasingly diminishing. And I know as I watched with my dad, he was aware of his cognitive decline, and he became increasingly fearful of what was happening to him because he could no longer really control anything that was around him. There's frustration, hopelessness. They're often ignored. I was just recently on Zoom conferencing with a chaplaincy cohort, actually, and we talked about, quickly walking through units because we have a list of things to do, and yet there are patients there that are ignored or walked past, and how do we make the time in our day to just be present for just a few minutes? They're inattentive because they're losing their ability to be attentive, irritable, lonely. Their life seems meaningless, and they become increasingly suspicious and paranoid. So I think it's always helpful to just bear these very real challenges that are happening inside of them as their disease progresses, because it really tills inside of us in the soil of our hearts and souls increased compassion, or it should. So what are some of the other changes? And we know this from our work, that they really experience a lot of grief and loss of becoming increasingly disconnected from their faith community. Especially for those individuals who are really identified with a particular church, a particular community, a particular parish. That is their identity in many ways, their spiritual identity. And so there is increasing grief and loss from this. Their inability to read their Bible or any of their prayer books, there's something that they may have had from their very early years that become inaccessible to them. Their inability to function well in a crowded space. Crowded services become a source of great distress. Some may increasingly become aware of their dependence on God. Some of them may articulate this in the most beautiful and profound way. If they have, we all know those moments of lucidity, where I call those graced moments, in that, they're all graced moments, but they're suddenly very able to articulate something beautiful and profound. And many times, as we know, the rote prayer or ritual actions also remain. There are certain things that may never leave them from their particular faith tradition, which is very beautiful. So I encourage kind of the starting point, where do we even start? And again, as chaplains, we know this, but it's always good to be aware of it. Seeing and loving the image of God in the least of our brothers and sisters. And this is from Richard Rohr, who has just marvelous resources. Christ uses only that as his description of the final judgment. Nothing about commandments, nothing about church attendance, simply a matter or our ability to see. And while this is in the Christian context, this can be used in terms of loving those of us around us who are often deemed as most unlovable in our society. And that's an awareness in any faith tradition. And again, from a Christian context, can we see Christ in the nobodies who can't play our game of success, in those who cannot reward us in return? When we see the image of God, or we see the image of our higher power, where we are not accustomed to seeing the image of God, then we see with eyes not of our own. So that is something else I always bring to my own presence of mind in any visit, in any setting, that it's seeing the people around me. There's a beautiful phrase from the 4th century desert fathers and mothers that I love, and I kind of use it as my own mantra. And that is to see all as God after God, to see all as God after God. And that's something that I really try to keep present, is particularly with our folks that are most frail and most in need. This is a beautiful resource I highly, highly recommend, Dancing with Dementia by Christine Bryden. She actually writes about her own experience. And this really frames up the pastoral care visit in such a beautiful way. Again, whether you're in an individual room visit, whether you're caring for a loved one at home, whether you're going quickly through a very large facility with many visits, or whether you're actually coordinating a religious service for folks in a dementia unit. I treasure your visit as a now experience in which I have connected spirit to spirit. And this is key. It is a now moment, and all that matters is the now. I need you to affirm my identity, and affirm my identity in the dignity of who I am, and walk alongside me. I may not be able to affirm you, but you have brought connection to me. You have allowed the divine to work through you. So that's another mantra that I think is something that we can carry in our hearts. So we've talked a little bit about some of the very diverse settings where we serve, and I'm just going to go through those. I know that when I did the workshop in June, many folks that were there, it talked about ministering to loved ones either at home in their own personal lives, in addition to their work that they did as spiritual caregivers. So as chaplains or as spiritual caregivers, do I minister at home in my own life, or do I go to the homes of people who have asked me to come? Am I a caregiver for my loved one? Do I go to the homes where there are caregivers that provide for physical needs? Am I called upon to provide spiritual needs in somebody's private home? Am I called upon to go into a home where a loved one is on hospice care? And as a spiritual provider, do I visit individuals cared for at home? So that's obviously one particular context where spiritual care will take the shape in a very definitive way. So then many of us may work in an independent living community or continuing care retirement community, or we may work in an assisted living facility, in a memory support community, or in a long-term skilled nursing care facility. And these are all very unique opportunities, and I've actually worked in all of these, and they do provide very different opportunities for spiritual care. So what does spiritual care look like for the residents under my care in this community? Is it something that I do individually? Is it something that I do communally? In the community, is it connected to a particular faith community? Is it a Masonic facility? Is it a Jewish facility? Is it a Catholic or Christian facility? Is it connected with particular faith communities that surround me in the geographic areas? Is it a strictly secular institution that allows or does not allow religious services? I know that one facility that I worked in, that I provided pastoral care for, was a secular chain community. There are chains all over the country, really, and was asked by the director to come in specifically for the Catholic residents to run communion services, and then run prayer services for those that were not Catholic. And we would gather everybody and sing and pray together, and provide them with Catholic Holy Communion, but then also spend time just in prayer and in song. So it really varies from facility to facility, as you know. And then our religious offerings, communal or individual. And I'm sure, as you know, for some of you work in hospitals, the visits are much shorter. And in many ways, they present more challenges because if there is sort of a rotation in and out, you don't have the opportunity to build some of those long-term relationships. So you're kind of doing spiritual care a little bit on the fly, where you're in there and you're present, and you hopefully have some kind of an assessment knowing where a patient is at as much as it's possibly conveyed, so that you can provide a moment of prayer, a moment of comfort, maybe if it's allowed, a touch on the arm, just an affirmation. And that is the spirit care in each of these situations. So where do we begin? Understanding communication. The key to providing authentic spiritual care to persons journeying with dementia is this. It's critical that you believe that what you can do and what you are doing does make a difference. And this is key. And I have a very close friend, colleague, who worked with the National Alzheimer's Association for many years. And she's a social worker. And, we talk a lot about how folks, particularly with some cognitive diminishment, in many ways, they have a heightened awareness of whether or not we want to be there. And I have experienced this over and over, really throughout my years of working with people with varying challenges, mental challenges. But you have to believe, because that person sitting in front of you knows, they sense that you want to be there or you don't. And the desire to be there to provide them with spiritual care and comfort in that moment is what makes all the difference. Even if our loved ones with dementia don't remember, you must believe in what you do. And that is my prayer for each of us, to never grow weary of what we're doing. You must believe in what you do and what you bring to the person that God has placed in front of you. And then in humility, be open to learning from them and receiving. The whole idea, as we know in chaplaincy, the person in front of us is the living human document, right? It's the person, I always feel that I learn far more from them. They are leading me on the journey as I go in to provide comfort and prayer and presence and spiritual care. So in humility, we must be open to learning from them and receiving. So remember, all pastoral care happens in the present moment, in the immediate. And that's something for us as planners, we have busy schedules, we have large rosters. One of my chaplain friends in a cohort out west is in a chaplain with hundreds of beds, and there's only one chaplain. Another one who's in the Ohio area has 4 chaplains for 300 beds. So all of us have so many different demands on us, but all pastoral care happens in the present moment and in the immediate. And that's what we bring to the person in front of us. And this is most crucial to remember for our loved ones with dementia, or for patients with dementia when we are providing spiritual care, that it can't be rushed, even when we know we've got a long list in that moment, to pray for peace, to pray for presence, and to be present to them, because that is where we are going to minister to them on that deep and profound level. So kind of the 3 cardinal rules of our pastoral care or our chaplaincy care is to remember, our role. What is it? Our role is to provide spiritual care. We're not social workers, we're not medical personnel. We might have that background, but in that moment, we're providing spiritual care. And what is our goal? Our goal in that moment is to be a presence of holiness, of sacredness, of affirmation, of goodness, and to help eliminate isolation, the isolation that they're feeling. And then the context, role, goal, and context. In what situation am I ministering? And what is my spiritual care? What am I able to do in the context in which I am present? So just some things to think about. And again, this will continue on in our subsequent weeks, but in the early stages of dementia or Alzheimer's, someone may still attend services. Prayer, ritual, and song may still be important. Encounter and engagement with others. In mid stages, there is a deeper awareness of feeling abandoned and an increased isolation and disconnection, which is manifested, of course, because of the disease. May become less tense and more relaxed and content. Sometimes it's just the opposite. There can be increased anxiety. Ritual, prayer, touch, eye contact, all of these work well in the mid stages. And then in the late stage, our beloved friends with dementia and Alzheimer may exhibit feelings of abandonment, increased isolation and disconnect. Oh, you know what? I repeated that. But they're actually, as I'm talking through these, I'm thinking of the various situations when I worked for several years in a memory care unit. And in those later stages, they still welcomed the presence. Many times they were sleeping, but I would put on music. They respond to the music, to the sacred songs. These are things that are very, very much within their memory, their deep memory, their distant memory, their long-term memory. So as they are really becoming less and less aware in the disease, there are still moments where they are able to respond to the sacredness that we provide for them. So we're just coming up on almost 1:45, and I would like to turn it over to Andres and any opportunities for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Debbie, for a very interesting and informative session. As you said right at the outset, some very sobering facts and figures. We do have now the opportunity to pose some questions or comments using the chat feature. I think most people who've attended Zoom webinars before are aware that you can write your questions in the chat box. For those of you who are unsure, if you hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen, a little taskbar will pop up, and one of the options will be chat. That will open up the chat feature box, and please do feel free to write any questions or comments. Those of you who are listening by phone and don't have the opportunity to access the chat feature, please do send in any questions that you have to me. You have my email address. It is Andres. It's acoursietis@nacc.org, and Debbie will address any such questions at the outset of next week's session. So for the moment, we don't have any chat questions. So Debbie, do you have any other comments that you'd like to make at this stage while we're waiting for some questions to come in?
Sure. You know, I know that one of the most prominent questions oftentimes is, you know, when you're engaged in a conversation with somebody with dementia or Alzheimer's, you know, and they really don't have a sense of reality. You know, I know that conventional wisdom years ago was that you would really try to bring them back to reality. And we know at this point that that is not the most compassionate or most effective way to minister to somebody, again, because it goes back to the reality that they can't control what is happening to them. But there is what one resource calls sort of the therapeutic fibbing. I don't like that phrase, but I would call it, you know, kind of compassionately entering into their world. What the Alzheimer's world is for them. And just some examples, you know, somebody who repeatedly states, I want to go home, I want to go home. And I've heard this many times. I heard this from my dad almost every single visit that when I was with him. It's really that desire for comfort, you know, the fear of what's happening. And so what do you do with that? Because you may want to say, well, they're already home. You're already home. You're not going anywhere else. But it's really, there's a kind of a three-step recommendation, which is to validate what they're feeling. compassionately, gently validate what they're feeling, redirect them, and perhaps in that redirection, to kind of distract them. So for example, to say, somebody's repeatedly saying, I want to go home, maybe saying, it's cold outside. Maybe we should get would you like to put a sweater on? And maybe it's a good idea to have a little bit of a snack before you go out, and then kind of distracting them and redirecting them. It can definitely make a difference in sort of just being gentle with them and then redirecting the conversation. And not every suggestion helps every single time. There can be multiple factors as to what's going on, but that is kind of a highly recommended approach: to validate, redirect, and then to distract, so that you can kind of bring them into a different line of thinking within a few minutes. So those were some of the things that I was thinking about. And as I said, there's great websites and resources that I'll be providing for everybody at the end as well. So.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. In fact, we now have some questions and comments. So Mary Jo asks, does it tend to drive a person deeper into isolation if they are introduced as, in quotation marks, this is my wife and she has dementia? What's the best way to respond?
That's a really good question, because depending on where they're at in the progression of the disease, they may not even recognize that this is their spouse. One of the things that I found was the recognition, the identity of their name is important, but depending on where they are at in the relationship, it's a great question, because thinking about all of the factors that are playing in, are they far enough along in the disease where they don't remember that they've been married to this particular person? So that would have to be discerned with the caregiver, because I've seen this with family members. They won't remember their spouse. They'll remember there was somebody there who cared for them. So knowing their name, but not necessarily the identifying the attachment as a spouse, is necessarily the best way. It can increase frustration. So that's a good question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Tim makes the comment, in addition to your suggestions, I tend to encourage the minimization of introducing new items into the person's environment. I try to keep the persons rooted in that which is most familiar.
And that's a great suggestion, because, and you bring up the important point of overstimulation, and what is familiar in that moment, whether it's music, big band music, or something from their early years that they are attracted to and drawn to. But I think that key point of not overstimulating and not having too many distractions is very, very valid. So thank you for that.
We have a question. How do you reconcile patients' needs for connection and touch and need for proper boundaries, so to avoid scandalizing others or being accused of adultophilia?
It's a great question, and we are increasingly cognizant of the importance of boundaries. And I know this as a minister in the Catholic Church, it's huge. For myself in various communal settings, I would be present with, there'd usually be a CNA or somebody else on the floor there. And I would make a point of even just putting my hand on the arm when I would have a small group gathered for a little bit of a prayer session. And I would just go individually, put my hand on their arm, and I would just touch them very gently that way, always being respectful of the fact that, this is not somebody I would embrace in a hug. In a room setting, it's a little bit more challenging. I think of one particular woman I worked with. She did not like touch, but I would come in and I would pray with her she happened to be Catholic. She wanted Holy Communion even as she was close to dying. And I would be very mindful of not touching her, but just being present with her and praying. So the boundary issue is huge. And we always have to go back to the context in which we're serving. If we're going to be isolated with someone alone in a room, my recommendation would be avoid touch as best as possible. You might maybe place a few fingers on their arm, but you may not. We had one woman who was extremely delusional and was accusing, and this was just part of her as she was diminishing in her brain cognitively. So the recommendation would always be to go in there with somebody else, so that if it's at all possible, be in there when there's a nurse there or a CNA. I know they're busy, but just for that quick visit if possible. So, and then in the larger setting, if you're in a waiting room where there's a lot of people, or the community room where there's a lot of people and there's people passing through, there's, I think, less of a concern for kind of trespassing past those boundaries. So hopefully that helps. That's a good question.
Okay, thanks. And Dawn writes, it seems as if some link a lack of hearing with the symptoms of dementia and can cause patients distress. What's a good way to address family members who visit in the later stages and speak negatively in the presence of the dementia patient?
Oh, that's a great question. And the reality is that, or I believe that all of that negative energy that is absorbed by our beloved. And my recommendation would be to gently draw somebody aside or draw a family aside and say, we really want to honor and respect and love your parent. And we don't believe that is something that really will assist them on this journey. I'm thinking of even some folks that I worked with many years ago in a different diocese that had differing cognitive abilities, and for people to talk in front of these beautiful folks as if they couldn't hear was hugely distressing to them. And they would physically react because they knew they were being talked around. So I think that it's important to remind loved ones that they are still beautiful people, that they are, with this disease, they are diminishing, but they're not unaware. They are deeply aware. And just to be respectful of that, and to be respectful of how would you want to be treated? I don't think I'd say it like that, but there is that, kind of that treat others as we wish to be treated. So that's a great question. And I would even liken some of those responses to their own fear and their own anxiety about something they can't control, and watching their loved one go through something that they really don't understand. And there's anger in that grief and loss as well. So good question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Debbie, for your answer. Right now, we don't have any more written questions in the chat feature. We do have another about 5 or 6 minutes left. So if you have any other comments while we wait to see if anyone comes in with any questions at the last minute.
Okay. Just, my encouragement, well, I'm thinking of a couple of different things actually, because I know that just in looking at the list that you sent me, the variety of places where people minister, and I can't possibly address all of them, but I know even when I've held religious services in long-term care settings, and sometimes they were the most busiest, the speaker would be going off and there's all of this distraction, but for that moment I worked incredibly hard to be present, to go around, to even just, put my hand possibly on their shoulder, say each person by name, welcome them by name. Even if I had a group of 20 folks in this community room where the loudspeaker was going. So always that that opportunity to just welcome them in, to really affirm them in who they are, in the dignity of who they are. So that's one particular setting. And I'm just another setting where we had folks with all different kinds of ailments and different needs. Again, that just trying to be present, trying to affirm each person, getting to know their names. Names are huge. We had one marvelous woman, and she would say, "Who am I?" over and over again. Just one of my favorite people, and I carry her in my heart. And I would say her name, you know, "You're Eleanor." And she'd say, "And who are you?" And I would say, "And I'm Debbie." And she would just hold on to my hand, and we would just sit. And she'd just hold my hand, and we would just sit. And she was in perfect comfort of just having somebody present with her for those few moments. So I think I just can't emphasize that enough. The individual, the saying of the names, the presence, the calm, unhurried as best as we are able in a field that really demands so much of us. And I'm very cognizant of that. So.
Okay, thank you. We do have a couple more questions that have come in. Mary Jo asks, when a person reaches stage 7 in the global deterioration scale and families ask about life support, what should we tell them? What do you recommend?
So life support, I'm wondering if that really ties into the whole advanced directives question. So I'm not sure I understand the question. Does it have to do with physical life support? So if it's a question about advanced directives and honoring the wishes, if that was addressed with their loved one before the advanced stages of the disease, that's what you really have to go back to. And then, there are so many challenges surrounding how do we address the end of life issues. That could, the ethics of chaplaincy, that can be a whole workshop in and of itself. So if I'm understanding you correctly, my sense is that you're asking about end of life care and what this should look like. And that is a hugely personal and family decision. So you'd really have to, I would recommend bringing in some of the ethics, maybe perhaps having an ethics consult with your ethics team, if you have an ethics team in your community, to talk about some of the complexities. What are the needs of the family? What's the spiritual background of the family? What are they looking for? What are they looking at? Where is the patient at? So there's a lot there. That's a huge topic, and it's a very important question. So I hope I answered it a little bit, but it's got to go back to the family and even to the ethics team if it's regarding end of life care.
Okay, thanks. So we're down to our last 2 minutes. I got 2 questions. First one is, how do you respond to a person with early stage dementia who talks about his or her own dementia and what she is doing to combat it, like doing crossword puzzles?
I would just encourage them. Because I think there's no, this is somebody who's just still trying to maintain some level of independence with being handed a diagnosis that is only going to get worse. And in those moments, just encourage them, affirm them, and I would even say enjoy it with them. Those can be those moments of grace where you can actually enjoy it with them while they are still able. So.
Okay, thanks. And last question before we close for today is, do you have suggestions on what kind of spiritual music is appropriate for group spiritual care for demented people of different faiths?
You know what? That's a great question, because I worked in those settings in a lot of different ways. And I actually would go back to some of the more familiar hymns. Depending it's looking at your community. Are they predominantly Christian? And then just trying to draw some of the more familiar songs I would carry a small speaker and actually my iPad, and I would project the songs through the small speaker on the Bluetooth. And there were some familiar hymns that that just everybody would join in. And so, and I'm trying to think, there were some very familiar songs that we had used in one particular setting that always, like He's Got the Whole World in His Hands. Something as beautiful and as simple as that, and people could clap to. And so it's just trying to find those commonalities of songs. How Great Thou Art, that's another one that everybody's familiar with. Amazing Grace. And if your population is not not Christian, if you've got, then to go into those faith backgrounds and find out what the commonalities of the music are that you can provide for them. So, but music is a great way to draw them out. And I that was really some of my favorite times in ministering, is using music. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Debbie. Unfortunately, we've run out of time for today. We will pick this up again next Tuesday, November the 26th at noon Central Time for session 2. Thank you, Debbie, for a very informative session 1. Thank you all who participated and took time out of their busy schedules and days to attend. And look forward to your participation again next week. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you, Andres. God bless.